Hey there, listener. If you're looking to spice things up this holiday season, our friends over at Tenga have you covered. Tenga is Japan's leading sexual wellness brand, specializing in discreet, stylish products that have revolutionized the market since 2005, with their emphasis on normalizing pleasure. Tenga has got some great bundles available at 12% off this December, including the 12 Cups of Christmas bundle with 12 different styles of the ready to use Tenga cup, the stocking stuffer bundle with a load of different one time use toys, as well as a whole lot of Flip Zero and lotion bundles for anyone looking for an easy to clean, reusable toy. Also, don't miss out on 10% off all Tenga merch starting December 23rd. You can find all of these offers on the official Tenga Store USA and Tenga Store Europe until January 1st. Check the show notes for the link and use code SEXandPSYCH to save 15% off your first purchase. Happy holidays. You're listening to the Sex and Psychology Podcast, the sex ed you never got in school and won't get anywhere else. I am your host, Dr. Justin Lehmiller. I am a social psychologist and research fellow at the Kinsey Institute and author of the book, Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. Erectile dysfunction is one of men's most common sexual problems. It's estimated that about half of men will experience it at some point in their lives. However, research has uncovered a curious phenomenon. It appears that gay men are substantially more likely to experience ED than heterosexual men. And interestingly, heterosexual men are more likely to experience premature ejaculation than gay men. So, what's up with that? That's what we're going to explore in this episode. We're going to talk about the many and varied reasons behind gay men's higher risk for erectile dysfunction, as well as why premature ejaculation seems to be less common in this community. We're also going to talk about tips for dealing with ED, including how to dial down performance pressure and anxiety, tips for improving body image, what to do when internalized homophobia affects sexual performance, and more. I am joined once again by Tom Brewitt, a licensed marriage and family therapist, trainer, consultant, and author who works extensively with the queer community. He is the founder of the Queer Relationship Institute, which provides therapy for queer folks and training for therapists who work with queer relationships. His book, The Go-To Relationship Guide for Gay Men, From Honeymoon to Lasting Commitment, will be published in March 2025. This is going to be another amazing conversation. Stick around and we're going to jump in right after the break. Do you ever find yourself dreaming about a career where you get to talk about sex and psychology all day long? What if I told you there's a place that can connect you with world-class experts and has a large, thriving community? Sexual Health Alliance does just that. Sexual Health Alliance helps you to build the career of your dreams and is at the forefront of sexuality education. Students come from all parts of the world and from all types of backgrounds. Whether you're in school just starting out on your journey or building advanced skills in your profession, Sexual Health Alliance's comprehensive certifications, engaging events, and self-paced online education will move you beyond the basics and set you up to become sexceptional. Visit sexualhealthalliance.com and start building the sexuality career of your dreams today. And let them know that you heard about Sexual Health Alliance on this podcast. If you love the science of sex as much as I do, consider becoming a friend of the Kinsey Institute at Indiana University. The Kinsey Institute is the world's premier research organization on sex and relationships, and you can help them continue the legacy of Dr. Alfred Kinsey, whose pioneering research changed everything we think we know about sex. Visit kinseyinstitute.org to make an impact. Your donations can help support ongoing research projects on critical topics. You can also show your support by following Kinsey Institute on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you for supporting sex science. Okay, Tom, let's talk about gay men and erectile dysfunction. So most of the research that's out there on sexual dysfunction and sexual problems in general has focused on heterosexual persons. And in fact, even the way that some sexual dysfunctions are clinically defined is very heteronormative. I mean, historically, things like ED and premature ejaculation were defined specifically in relation to penile vaginal intercourse. So our knowledge as to how sexual difficulties relate to and occur in gay men has been limited. But we do know that a growing amount of data now suggests that rates of ED are actually even higher in gay men than they are in heterosexual men, with a recent meta-analysis finding that gay men are about 1.5 times more likely to have ED. So, as a sex and relationship therapist, I wanted to ask, was this surprising to you? Have you noticed the high prevalence of ED among gay and queer men in your practice?
This is not surprising to me at all, actually. I do work with some heterosexual couples, but mostly I work with queer men and queer male couples. And I definitely see it coming up more in the queer male population that I work with. And I think there's lots of different reasons for that. I'm sure you have some ideas, but again, I wish there was more research.
I wish there was more research too. But before we get into those reasons, something else that was really interesting that came out of this research is that we see that while gay men are reporting higher rates of ED than heterosexual men are reporting higher rates of premature ejaculation than gay men are. And that was something I found to be really interesting. And I have some thoughts on why that might be the case. But I'm curious as to whether you had any idea why premature ejaculation seems to be a less common issue for gay men.
I found that a little bit puzzling. And so, I'm thinking porn. I'm like wondering if I have lots of different ideas, but nothing where I'm like, that's the reason.
So, one thought that I had was that I think that in same sex relationships, male same sex relationships, that premature ejaculation, is sometimes eroticized by gay men. So, I have heard from some gay guys who say that they actually find it really hot when their partner orgasms quickly. And sometimes this is in the context of anal sex where the receptive partner is penetrated and then has like an orgasm with very little in the way of actual penile stimulation. Sometimes it's a hands-free orgasm, right? And many people find that to be incredibly erotic, that like there was this orgasm that didn't even require any direct penile stimulation. And so I think there's sometimes this eroticization of PE that happens in the gay community that doesn't happen so often among heterosexuals. I will say I have heard from some heterosexual women who do find it erotic when their partner climaxes very quickly. And I know some people who are listening to this are like, that doesn't seem right to me. But when the way that these women describe it is that they say they interpret it as their partner is just so aroused and so turned on by them that they can't control themselves, right? So in some ways, premature ejaculation, in terms of the way that it is interpreted, is just sort of about the context in which it happens, right? And I think, more broadly with regard to the context, we kind of need to think about somebody who ejaculates quickly. If it's in a male male context versus a male female context, that's just totally different in a lot of ways, right? So PE, or rapid ejaculation, might be more of an impediment to female pleasure, but not as much to male pleasure, and for example, if you also have two guys who both have rapid ejaculation and they're together, it's not going to be a problem for either of them, right? So, context really matters here a lot.
And I was also thinking, with in a heterosexual, if they're going to be penetrative sex, the male partner is often penetrating. I've heard situations where it's like, okay, if someone has a history of PE, they may decide to bottom because when they bottom, if they're going to have anal sex, it doesn't stimulate them in the way that you're describing. They actually end up being, soft, and so they don't come as quickly. And so, there's different roles that people can slip into in male male sex.
Yeah. And, I think what is pleasurable about male male sex is very different to different people. Some people really get off on just prostate stimulation and don't actually even want any penile stimulation, right? So, different things work for different people when it comes to sex. But yeah, I think that issue of context is really key when we're looking at why something like premature ejaculation doesn't seem to be as much of an issue for gay and queer men compared to heterosexual men. It's not to say that it can't be an issue. It certainly is for some people, but it just seems to be a lesser issue for various reasons.
And it would be 2 to 1 in my practice in terms of the ED versus it's much more of an issue I found.
Yeah. And I think it is also worth acknowledging that PE and ED sometimes go together, right? And we often talk about these things as being totally separate sexual issues, but sometimes premature ejaculation and erectile dysfunction can kind of like feed into each other. Where, for example, if you have a history of premature ejaculation, you might start getting anxious during sexual encounters, and then that can create arousal difficulties, leading you to have erectile dysfunction, right? And also for people who have erectile dysfunction, sometimes that leads to a pattern of behavior where when they get an erection, they try to ejaculate as quickly as possible, right? And so it leads to that series of or pattern of rapid ejaculation. So it's just an interesting side note that sometimes these things go together and sometimes one is kind of like masking the other. So for some people, they actually kind of need both of them to be treated at the same time. So let's talk about some of the reasons behind why gay men might have higher rates of erectile dysfunction. Now, as with any sexual problem, the answer is not simple, right? There are likely to be many contributing factors. But let's start with the issue of performance pressure. So, regardless of sexual orientation, there's this idea that men are always down to fuck and should always be ready to go. And porn reinforces this idea that guys are just always rock hard and able to maintain erections for very long periods of time. But this performance pressure may be even more acute for gay men who actually consume even more porn than heterosexual men do. So tell us a little bit about how performance pressure and anxiety can contribute to erectile difficulties in gay men. And also, is there anything we can do to dial down the pressure a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, if you figure out you're not in your body, right? If the anxiety is running the show, you're not able to actually slow down and have the pleasurable experiences of what sex can be. And so I think if you're focused on the external and your partner in a way that doesn't feel good to you, then it's going to be really, really difficult to actually be fully embodied. And, I think we have to be fully embodied in order to perform the best that we can sexually. So it makes a lot of sense. And especially, we know that mood disorders, anxiety and depression, they're much higher in the gay male population than the straight population.
And so, how can people learn to become more embodied or to be more mindful during sex so that they can kind of like get out of their head and get into the moment? Do you have any tips on that?
I think it starts with you. I think it starts with being able to have a personal sexual pleasure practice. And so, are you able to actually, without a partner present and maybe without so much pornography on, are you able to be with your body? Are you able to kind of notice the sensations that feel good? And then when you translate that into partnered sex, what can you do to actually slow things down? Like, can you think about the five senses? Can you get more, interested in smells and tastes and sights and actually see what you can do to be present in the moment? This will work if you're talking about something like anxiety or performance anxiety sometimes. Most of the issues around erectile dysfunction start with vascular issues, right? So as long as you're screening for that and making sure that there's not something physical going on, there's lots of different ways to work with this.
Yeah. And I think something else that can be important here is communicating with your partner, because I think sometimes our partners inadvertently put pressure on us to orgasm. And, that can be something that can get in the way of your ability to have an orgasm. And it can sometimes reduce arousal, creating, difficulties maintaining an erection. So, for example, lots of people engage in various forms of dirty talk and sexual communication. And, they might say things like, you know, come for me, baby, or I really want you to come, or, it can be well intentioned and like it's communicating your desires and your interests, but it can also put pressure on your partner to feel like, oh, I have to have an orgasm. And then that sort of takes them out of the moment and gets them into their head. And so, if that is something that is an issue for you, it might be worth talking to your partner about kind of how you communicate during sex so that they're not like inadvertently putting that extra layer of pressure on you. Because some of us just find it very difficult to relax and be present during sex. And then, sometimes something is said just kind of in the heat of the moment that just sort of totally takes us out of the moment.
Orgasm focused sex, I think, is the one of the biggest issues I see couples come in and complain about because, it can be really hot. And that's what porn really is focused on, right? It's like, okay, the orgasm focused sex. And we know that anxiety and sex are really not a very good mix.
Oil and
And
water.
so, oil and water. But what you're describing takes a lot of guts and courage. It sounds simple to say, bring this up with your partner, but, I think you have to have a lot of trust there to actually talk about sex at all. And I'd recommend not talking about it in the bedroom at first, do, do it the next day or give some space there because it's really tricky. We can have a lot of sex, but we can't talk about it.
Exactly. I often say it's a lot easier for many people to have sex than it is to talk about it. And then unfortunately, many of the times that people do talk about sex, for some couples, for some people in relationships, it's only when there's a problem. And so that then leads sex to become this really high stakes topic of conversation because then they know if their partner's bringing it up, it's like, oh, there's a problem. And they go into high alert, fight or flight state. And that becomes a whole other issue and impediment to having productive conversations about sex. So I think part of this is also just kind of normalizing discussions and conversations about sex so that, when you're talking about it, you're not automatically going into that fight or flight state and know that it's going to turn into some kind of conflict.
And I've heard anecdotally, gay men who say, we have great conversations about sex. I ask him if he wants to have sex. Okay, what else do the conversations involve? Just because you're communicating you want to have sex, or it was good or it wasn't that great. There's so many more nuanced conversations you can have about this topic together.
Yeah, so, so true. Now, related to performance pressure, something else that may be at play here is body image. And we know from the research that gay men have more body anxiety than straight men in terms of both their overall appearance and in terms of their penis size. And again, porn probably plays some role here. But there's also the role of gay media in general and gay dating and hookup apps where guys with chiseled bodies are constantly celebrated. So, talk to us a little bit about how body image issues affect gay men. And as a therapist, is there anything you recommend for guys who struggle with body image?
Yeah, I mean, body image issues are huge. And unfortunately, they're only getting worse, I think, with the more social media that there is out there. And the more you can pop a filter on and get exactly the right angle, and then you look like some Greek god or something, and you think that's the only way that you can be an attractive or successful gay man in the sex and dating world. Luckily, I think that there are ways that you can work with this. I mean, one thing I heard recently was, who are the people that you're looking at on social media? If you actually open your Instagram feed and you search, what are you seeing? If you're seeing only guys with 8-pack abs, you probably have to do some curating in, what you're actually consuming, because the more that you consume, it becomes this vicious feedback cycle. One question I love to ask gay men is there one thing about your body that you actually maybe can tolerate, not even that you like, because that can be a little hard for some people, but that's a really hard question for some people. Like, what is one part of your body that you actually can tolerate?
Yeah, body tolerance, right? It's a place to start, right? We want to get to the point of body appreciation. And, there are many body appreciation exercises that you can do. You can just stand in front of a mirror naked and just find one part of your body that you can tolerate. And it can be anything. It can be your eyelashes, it can be your fingernails, it can be your beard, whatever, right? Just find one part and start from there. And, it does take time in terms of learning to like and enjoy and appreciate your body. And sometimes working with a therapist is the right answer for that because they have more tools that they can help you with. But yeah, it really starts with finding some way to tolerate and then learn to appreciate your body. And I think something else that is important to recognize is that, in the gay community, there are lots of different sub communities that celebrate different body types. You got your twinks and your otters and your bears. And, there's so many different subtypes or subcategories of the gay community where people who look like you or have your body type or size or proportions are celebrated and are considered attractive. And so part of it too might be finding your community and surrounding yourself by people who are attracted to people with different body types, right? So, something we've said before on the show many times is that you are somebody's fetish, right? You might not think that you are because you might have a complicated relationship with your own body, but there are people out there who will find you attractive.
Mm-hmm. And even expanding on that, like, can you start watching different porn? If
Mhm.
you're only watching porn where somebody looks a certain way, what if you started expanding your palette a little bit? Like, I just love what you're describing there. Like, the more that you can be expansive with the people that you're looking at and the images that you're consuming, I think the easier it's going to be to start tolerating and then maybe appreciating and loving your body.
And that might also include moving to different dating apps or ways of connecting with people. We're not going to mention the app that shall not be named, but there are different apps out there that cater to different subgroups within the gay community where it can be a friendlier experience for people, but also where people with different body types might find themselves more accepted and have more suitors and so forth. So, yeah, it's partially about the kind of environment that you surround yourself with. Now, in the previous episode, we talked about how gay men have higher rates of substance abuse. And paradoxically, many gay men use substances to enhance sex, but those substances can also impair erectile function, right? So, for example, they might use alcohol to reduce inhibitions. They might use poppers to relax or to enhance sensation, or they might use drugs like GHB, ecstasy, ketamine, the list goes on. But while these drugs, like I said, can have some positive sexual effects, they also have unwanted side effects like ED, right? Many of them do. And, of course, there's individual variability. It always depends on how a given substance interacts with your body and how much of it you're consuming. But tell us a little bit about recreational drugs and, how common they are in the gay community and how that can be used to enhance sex, but also can impair function.
It's tricky because when another issue arises, people will find a solution, right? So if you're having trouble, for example, maintaining an erection while you're using some kind of party drug, then people will go and pop a Viagra or, use another kind of performance enhancing supplement, which can then just increase the danger, right? I mean, because you're starting to mix multiple substances, and then you may be having riskier sex, and there's all sorts of stuff that can go on there. So I think a good place to start is, why are you using the substance that you're using? What are you getting out of it? If it is bringing something positive to your life, great. But like, when is the moment when it's going to start actually tipping the scale and moving into being more of a negative than a positive? And are you able to have sober sex? So many people, they enjoy enhanced sex, but then they're not able to have sober sex in the same way. That could be a real challenge for breaking the habit or the cycle once you get stuck in it.
Yeah, and I think that's so true for many gay and queer men is that many of them don't know how to have sober sex, or they've never tried it because oftentimes, and we'll talk more about this as we go along, but there are higher rates of trauma and other things that are going on in this community, and substances are often a way of coping with that and allowing them to enjoy sex and to access pleasure. And that pleasure is an important part of kind of how they deal or cope with some of the trauma that they're experiencing. But there's that intermediate step of substance use. And then that substance use can also get in the way of that pleasure by creating erectile and other difficulties. And as you pointed out, there's often a lot of polysubstance use where one substance creates a sexual issue and then they just take another substance to counteract that. But sometimes it can be dangerous to mix those substances. You can run into risk of overdose. You can run into risk of substances that are not compatible. Like, for example, you shouldn't use poppers and Viagra at the same time because that can lead to a dangerous drop in blood pressure and other things. And so there are lots of things that people need to know about using substances and sex. And, I'm not going to be one to say you should never use substances with sex because we know a lot of people do. So I think, a harm reduction perspective is the way we have to look at this, is that, using substances in sex is inevitable. It's going to happen. But if people are going to do that, they should do it in the safest way possible. So part of it is educating people about what they need to know when it comes to using substances in sex. But I think also going back to your question of, why are you using substances during sex? And are there other underlying issues that we might need to address here? Is there unresolved trauma? And is the substance kind of a coping mechanism for dealing with that trauma? And maybe we'd be able to have and enjoy sober sex if we just dealt with the trauma first.
And I know for me personally, it's been an ongoing journey. I like sex a lot, and I have sex, and I've had sex with substances and sober sex, and being able to actually be in my body and have a connected experience with another person, it isn't always easy, and it does feel really vulnerable and takes courage.
Yeah, and it's a totally different kind of sex, right? Sober sex is very different. And, it is something that I think if you've never tried it or you can't remember the last time you had it, it's worth giving it a try to see if you can do it. And if you can't, then let's talk about, what are some of the reasons why? And maybe that's where speaking with a therapist might be helpful or come in handy.
100%.
Now, another factor that's likely at play here is the fact that gay men, on average, have higher rates of mood disorders, which I think you alluded to previously, including higher rates of depression. And as a result, they also have higher rates of antidepressant use. So, in some studies I've seen, gay men are about 1.5 times more likely to have been prescribed antidepressants compared to heterosexual persons. And we know that sexual side effects, including erectile difficulties, are common with antidepressants. So I wanted to ask, if someone is taking antidepressants and they're having unwanted sexual side effects, what can you do about that?
I think we should broaden it to be any kind of medication, right? Because we know hair loss medications also can cause some sexual side effects. So really being thinking about, like, most therapists or most doctors should be, hopefully, and if you're seeing a queer affirming doctor, will be asking you these questions and asking you positive questions about your sex life, because I think it's a right to be able to have pleasure in your life. With the antidepressants, I think what can be tricky is that if some people have been on antidepressants for 20 years, and it's just that they're not really sure kind of how to be, what it would feel like if they weren't on those antidepressants. Some people, it's more acute, and it's a newer experience, and the sexual side effects are new. So, with antidepressants, sometimes if you stay on them for a few weeks, the side effects will kind of abate themselves. But really be talking to your doctor about this and advocating for yourself that you deserve to have a pleasurable sex life. And so if you're taking some sort of substance or medication that is getting in the way of you having a pleasurable sex life, you can look at some other alternatives. There's lots of other depression alternatives like, ketamine therapy, or some people even find success with adding more behavioral stuff like exercise and mindfulness and all sorts of stuff like that. There's lots of different ways that you can address the depression without having to give way or give up on pleasure.
Yeah, and it might also involve speaking with your doctor and taking a lower dose because sometimes lowering or adjusting the dose can get rid of the sexual side effects. Sometimes switching to an antidepressant that's not in the SSRI category can also help to address the issue. And some people also take SSRIs with bupropion, which is a different type of antidepressant as a way of counteracting the effects, right? So there are lots of different things that you can do here, but it's important to talk to your doctor. And I'm glad you brought up the point about hair loss medications because this goes back to our body image discussion we were having earlier, right? Gay men have a lot more body image issues in general and are more likely to take hair loss medications and other things that are going to help to counteract anxieties or concerns they might have about their bodies. And so you might have some gay men who are taking antidepressants and hair loss medications and other, medications that are designed to address certain aspects of their appearance. And so you can have all of these different drugs and substances that might be having sexual side effects. And so I think it is really important, when people are thinking about taking a new medication, you should ask your doctor, are there any potential sexual side effects of this? Because doctors don't always come out and tell patients that because many doctors are uncomfortable talking about sex in general. So, I wish it was the case that doctors would just tell us all these things, but sometimes we either have to do the research ourselves or initiate the conversation with our doctors to find out, how is this going to affect my body? Because if you're taking one of these medications and, it's helping you in one way, but then it's interfering with or making it impossible for you to access pleasure, that's going to be a serious issue to deal with. So, yeah, there's lots to consider here when it comes to the realm of medications. Now, some studies suggest that internalized homophobia and minority stress can be another factor in explaining higher rates of ED among gay men. So, tell us, Tom, how can something like internalized homophobia impact sexual performance? And what can you do if you're somebody who struggles with this?
Yeah, so if we think about internalized homophobia as the hatred of being gay turned inward, if you feel a sense of shame about being gay, you're probably going to feel a sense of shame about having gay sex, right?
Mhm.
The idea of all of the beautiful, wonderful gay sexual activities that you can have, there may be some lingering shameful feelings about that. And so, if we just kind of follow that train of thought, it makes sense that it would then potentially get in the way of having an erection or, having a pleasurable sexual experience.
And so, what can someone do about that? If you're somebody who has that internalized homophobia or internalized shame, what's the answer?
So the first step is recognizing it. So many people don't even recognize it. Internalized homophobia. I can't tell you how many times I'll be talking with a client and I may just like, do you think that could be internalized homophobia? And it's like, oh, I never thought about it that way, right? So recognizing it is the first step. And then I think having some compassion and grace with yourself. It's going to take some time to move through this. Hopefully, you're going to be working with a good mental health professional to help you through this because it's not something that you should have to do alone. It can be a really complicated onion to peel back. And then there are practices and ways that you can start developing a more positive connection with your sexuality and your identity. But again, it will take some time.
Can you share an example of somebody who maybe has internalized homophobia but doesn't recognize it? Like, what might be something that has come up in your therapy office where somebody says, oh, yeah, maybe that's a manifestation of that they previously didn't recognize?
The one I hear the most often is, oh, all gay men are sluts, or the gay community is so terrible, or everyone is so conceited. Like any kind of comment like that, that's about the whole gay community at large, to me is usually a pretty big indicator that there's some, internalized feelings going on there. Because we're not going to use a big brush and paint like that across other kinds of differences in the same way that someone who is struggling with internalized homophobia will do that around the gay community.
Yeah, makes sense. So it seems like today ED drugs are being marketed aggressively to men, right? Odds are if you're on social media, you're going to have, and you're a man, you're going to have ED drugs advertised to you. And a lot of this marketing seems to target gay men specifically, and gay men seem to be using these drugs at very high rates. In fact, in one study I saw of men who were visiting a sexual health clinic, nearly one third of gay men had used Viagra compared to less than 1 in 10 heterosexual men. And these drugs can certainly be helpful in improving erectile dysfunction. And I think they can be great drugs. They can be very valuable tools for dealing with this particular sexual difficulty, but they don't necessarily address other underlying issues, right? So, Tom, is more Viagra the solution, or is that just a band aid in some cases?
The first step is always talking to your doctor, right? And maybe even a cardiologist, because we know hands down the biggest cause of ED is vascular issues. So like that's the first step. I want to make sure, putting that out there. Then the psychological aspects that can potentially contribute to it. Viagra or Cialis may help you have some confidence in the moment. It may help you in a group sex scenario. It may help you if you're experimenting or exploring in a way where it feels new or different. It can be helpful, certainly. And if we're talking about internalized homophobia, if we're talking about body image issues, if we're talking about substance use, like that's not going to be the silver bullet, so to say, for all things ED related.
Yeah, so it is important for people to understand, what is the cause of their erectile difficulties. And consulting with a healthcare professional is an important first step in making sure that it gets correctly diagnosed. And sometimes the answer is medication. Sometimes it's working with a sex therapist. Sometimes it's doing a bit of both, right? ED is one of those issues where there are lots of different ways to come at it and to treat it. But I think the most helpful solution really depends on identifying what the cause is for that given individual. And, sometimes Viagra and these other medications are just used as a band aid because it's easier to take a pill than it is to do the work on yourself. The question is, what do you really want to do here? Is it that you just want the quick and easy temporary solution, or do you want to do the harder work and address the underlying issues? And, I get it. Like it's hard for us to do the work, but sometimes that is the thing that's going to pay off the most in the long run.
And say you've had an experience, like I'm just going to kind of make something up here, but if you lived through sexual assault or sexual abuse, maybe you're going to use some Viagra as you're also doing some trauma therapy and as you're also kind of working through the abuse and trauma that you're trying to heal. Because yeah, we're not going to say you shouldn't have sex for, however long it takes you to heal. Thinking about some kind of combination that will enable you to have pleasure, but also is addressing the core issue, I think is really important, like you're saying.
Yeah, customized solution for the individual. So, last question, Tom. Any other tips or advice on dealing with erectile difficulties for gay men? Anything we haven't covered yet so far?
I just want to say it's not that uncommon. So I think being able to talk about it with your partners, with your doctor, with your therapist, like take that risk because you don't have to continue to live with this. Like there are solutions, there are possibilities. Sex therapy is a great way to kind of start working on some of the more emotional issues or psychological issues that could be at play. But there could be something physical going on. So I've heard far too many men just not even bring it up and just kind of like sweep it under the rug. And if you take nothing else from this conversation, please don't do that.
And I think also let's normalize the fact that the penis doesn't always do what you want it to do, right? So sometimes there will be situations where you want to have an erection, but you won't be able to get one. That's normal. It's a sexual disappointment. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have a sexual dysfunction in need of treatment, but lots of people will interpret even just a one time sexual disappointment as a bigger underlying issue or indictment of their entire sexuality. And then that can turn into a sexual dysfunction depending on the way that they interpret it. So I think we need to give ourselves and our partners a little bit of grace when the penis doesn't do what we want it to do.
And kind of building on that, something I heard recently, and maybe you've heard this too, is that like, at age 40% of the time, it's going to be difficult. At age 50, as we get older, we have to just accept that our bodies change and we're not going to be able to do the things that we were able to do when we were 20. It's just a part of growing older.
Yeah, and to be flexible and fluid in the way that you meet your sexual needs, because the more options you have on the menu, the more ways you have to experience pleasure. So, thank you so much for this amazing conversation, Tom. It was a pleasure to have you here. Can you please tell my listeners where they can go to learn more about you and your work?
Yes, thanks for having me. You can check out my website, www.queerrelationshipinstitute.com. I'm also on Instagram, Queer Relationship Institute.
Thank you for listening. To keep up with new episodes of this podcast, visit my website, Sex and Psychology, at sexandpsychology.com, or subscribe on your favorite platform, where I hope you'll take a moment to rate and review the show. You can also follow me on the socials for daily sex research updates. I'm on Blue Sky and X at Justin Lehmiller, and Instagram at Justin J. Lehmiller. Also, be sure to check out my book, Tell Me What You Want. And don't forget, if you're looking to spice things up this holiday season, our friends over at Tenga have you covered. Tenga is Japan's leading sexual wellness brand, specializing in discreet, stylish products that have revolutionized the market since 2005, with their emphasis on normalizing pleasure. Tenga has got some great bundles available at 12% off this December, including the 12 Cups of Christmas bundle with 12 different styles of the ready-to-use Tenga cup, the stocking stuffer bundle with a load of different one-time use toys, as well as a whole lot of Flip Zero and lotion bundles for anyone looking for an easy-to-clean, reusable toy. Also, don't miss out on 10% off all Tenga merch starting December 23rd. You can find all of these offers on the official Tenga Store USA and Tenga Store Europe until January 1st. Check the show notes for the link and use code SEXandPsych to save 15% off your first purchase. Happy holidays.